In the early hours of August 31, 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died from injuries sustained earlier that day in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris, France. Dodi Fade, Diana's partner, and Henri Paul, the driver of the Mercedes W140 S-Class, were pronounced dead at the scene. Her bodyguard, Trevor Rhys-Jones, was severely injured, but survived the crash. Some media claimed the erratic behavior of the paparazzi following the car, as reported by the BBC, had contributed to the crash. In 1999, a French investigation found that Paul, who lost control of the vehicle at high speed while intoxicated by alcohol and under the effects of prescription drugs, was solely responsible for the crash. He was the deputy head of security at the Hotel Ritz and had earlier goaded paparazzi waiting for Diana and Fade outside the hotel. Antidepressants and traces of an antipsychotic in his blood might have worsened Paul's inebriation. In 2008, the jury at a British inquest, Operation Paget, returned a verdict of unlawful killing through grossly negligent driving by Paul and the following paparazzi vehicles. Some media reports claimed Rhys-Jones survived because he was wearing a seat belt, but other investigations revealed that none of the occupants of the car were wearing them. Diana was 36 years old when she died. Her death sparked an unprecedented outpouring of public grief in the United Kingdom and worldwide, and her televised funeral was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people. The royal family were criticized in the press for their reaction to Diana's death. Public interest in Diana has remained high and she has retained regular press coverage in the decades since her death. Circumstances. Events preceding the crash. On Saturday, August 30, 1997, Princess Diana left the Olbia Airport, Sardinia on a private jet and arrived at Le Bourget Airport in Paris with Egyptian film producer Dodi Fade, the son of businessman Mohammed Al Fade. They had stopped there en route to London, having spent the preceding 9 days together on board Mohammed's yacht Jonical on the French and Italian Riviera. They had intended to stay there for the night. Mohammed was and remains the owner of the Hotel Ritz Paris and resided in an apartment on Rue Arsène House, a short distance from the hotel, just off the Avenue des Champs-Élysées. Henri Paul, the deputy head of security at the Ritz, had been instructed to drive the hired black 1994 armored Mercedes S280 sedan in order to elude the paparazzi. A decoy vehicle left the Ritz first from the main entrance on Place Vendôme, attracting a throng of photographers. Diana and Fade then departed from the hotel's rear entrance, Rue Cambon, at around 12:20 on August 31 Cest, heading for the apartment in Rue Arsène House. They did this to avoid the nearly 30 photographers waiting in front of the hotel. Diana and Fade were the rear passengers. Trevor Rhys-Jones, a member of the Fade family's personal protection team, was in the front passenger seat. The occupants were not wearing seat belts. After leaving the Rue Cambon and crossing the Place de la Concorde, they drove along Cours la Reine and Cours Albert I the embankment road along the right bank of the River Seine into the Place de l'Alma underpass. The crash. At 12:23, Paul lost control of the car at the entrance to the Pont de l'Alma underpass. The car reportedly struck a passing white Fiat, swerved to the left of the two-lane carriageway and collided head-on with the 13th pillar that supported the roof, as there are no guardrails. It was traveling at an estimated speed of 105 km per hour, more than twice the tunnel's 50 km per hour speed limit. It spun, hit the stone wall of the tunnel backwards and came to a stop. The impact caused substantial damage, particularly to the front half of the vehicle. Witnesses arriving shortly after the crash reported smoke. Witnesses also reported that photographers on motorcycles swarmed the Mercedes sedan before it entered the tunnel. Aftermath. With the 4 occupants still in the wrecked car, the photographers, who had been driving slower and were some distance behind the Mercedes, reached the scene. Some rushed to help, tried to open the doors and help the victims, while some of them took pictures. Police arrived around 10 minutes after the crash at 12:30 and an ambulance was on site 5 minutes later, according to witnesses. France Info Radio reported that one photographer was beaten by witnesses who were horrified by the scene. 5 of the photographers were arrested directly. Later, 2 others were detained and around 20 rolls of film were taken directly from the photographers. Police also impounded their vehicles afterwards. Firefighters also arrived at the scene to help remove the victims. Rhys-Jones was still conscious, with multiple serious facial injuries and a head contusion. The front occupants' airbags had functioned normally. Diana, who had been sitting in the right rear passenger seat, was also still conscious but critically injured. The crash mostly affected the right-hand side of her body, indicating that she was sitting sideways in her seat at the time of impact. Her ribs and arm were fractured and her right collarbone was dislocated, and she suffered from swelling and bruising to the brain. She was reported to murmur repeatedly, "Oh my God," and after the photographers and other helpers were pushed away by police, "Leave me alone." In June 2007, the Channel 4 documentary Diana, the witnesses in the tunnel claimed that the first person to touch Diana was off-duty physician Frédéric Maillet, who chanced upon the scene. Maillet reported that Diana had no visible injuries but was in shock. She was reported to have been extremely disturbed and removed a drip by force while shouting incoherently. After being sedated and removed from the car at 1 o'clock, she went into cardiac arrest and, following external cardiopulmonary resuscitation, her heart started beating again. Diana was moved to the SAMU ambulance at 1:18, left the scene at 1:41 and arrived at the Pitti Salpêtrière hospital at 02:06. Fate had been sitting in the left rear passenger seat and was pronounced dead shortly afterwards. Paul was also pronounced dead on removal from the wreckage. Both were taken directly to the Institut Médico-Legal, the Paris mortuary, not to a hospital. Paul was later found to have a blood alcohol level of 1.75 grams per liter of blood, about 3.5 times the legal limit in France. Diana's injuries were extensive, and resuscitation attempts, including internal cardiac massage, were unsuccessful. Her heart had been displaced to the right side of the chest, which tore the upper left pulmonary vein and the pericardium. Diana died at the hospital at 3 o'clock. The anesthetist Bruno Rioux announced her death at 6 o'clock at a news conference held at the hospital. Later that morning, French Prime Minister Lionel Jospin and Interior Minister Jean-Pierre Chevènement visited the hospital. At around 1700 hours, Diana's former husband, Charles, who was then Prince of Wales, and her 2 older sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows, arrived in Paris. The group visited the hospital along with French President Jacques Chirac and thanked the doctors for trying to save her life. Charles accompanied Diana's body to the UK later the same day. They departed from Vélizy-Villacoublay Air Base and landed at RAF Nordholt, and a bearer party from the Queen's Colour Squadron transferred her coffin, which was draped with the royal standard with an ermine border, to a hearse. Her remains were finally taken to the Hammersmith and Fulham mortuary in London for a post-mortem examination later that day. Initial media reports stated Diana's car had collided with the pillar at 190 km per hour, and that the speedometer's needle had jammed at that position. It was later announced that the car's speed upon collision was 95-110 km/h, about twice as fast as the speed limit of 50 km per hour. In 1999, a French investigation concluded the Mercedes had come into contact with another vehicle in the tunnel. The driver of the Fiat was never conclusively traced, although many believed the driver was Le Van Ton. The specific vehicle was not identified. It was remarked by Robin Cook, the British Foreign Secretary, that if the crash had been caused in part by being hounded by paparazzi, it would be doubly tragic. Diana's younger brother, the Earl Spencer, also blamed tabloid media for her death. An 18-month French judicial investigation concluded in 1999 that the crash was caused by Paul, who lost control at high speed while intoxicated. No charges were brought against the paparazzi who had been pursuing the princess car. Mourning. Members of the public were invited to sign a book of condolence at St. James's Palace. A book of condolence was also set up by the British Embassy in the US. All 11,000 light bulbs at Harrods department store, owned by Mohammed Al-Fayed, were turned off and not switched on again until after the funeral. Throughout the night, members of the Women's Royal Voluntary Service and the Salvation Army provided support for people queuing along the Mall. More than 1 million bouquets were left at her London residence, Kensington Palace, while at her family's estate of Althorpe the public was asked to stop bringing flowers as the volume of both visitors and flowers in the surrounding roads was said to be causing a threat to public safety. By September 10, the pile of flowers outside Kensington Gardens was 5 feet deep in places and the bottom layer had started to compost. The people were quiet, queuing patiently to sign the book and leave their gifts. Fresh flowers, teddy bears, and bottles of champagne were later donated and distributed among the sick, the elderly, and children. Cards, personal messages, and poems were collected and given to Diana's family. Funeral and burial. Early on, it was uncertain if Diana would receive a ceremonial funeral, since she had lost the status of Her Royal Highness following her divorce from Prince Charles in 1996. Diana's death was met with extraordinary public expressions of grief, and her funeral at Westminster Abbey on September 6 drew an estimated 3 million mourners and onlookers in London. Outside the Abbey and in Hyde Park, crowds watched and listened to proceedings on large outdoor screens and speakers as guests filed in, including representatives of the many charities of which Diana was patron. Attendees included U.S. First Lady Hillary Clinton and French First Lady Bernadette Chirac, as well as celebrities including Italian tenor Luciano Pavarotti and 2 friends of Diana, George Michael and Elton John. John performed a rewritten version of his song Candle in the Wind that was dedicated to her, known as Goodbye England's Rose or Candle in the Wind. 1997, the single became the best-selling single since UK and US singles charts began in the 1950s, with total sales exceeding 33 million units. Protocol was disregarded when the guests applauded the speech by Earl Spencer, who strongly criticized the press and indirectly criticized the royal family for their treatment of her. The funeral is estimated to have been watched by 31.5 million viewers in Britain. Precise calculation of the worldwide audience is not possible, but it was estimated to be around 2.5 billion. The ceremony was broadcast to 200 countries and in 44 languages. After the end of the ceremony, Diana's coffin was driven to Althorpe in a Daimler hearse. Mourners cast flowers at the funeral procession for almost the entire length of its journey, and vehicles even stopped on the opposite carriageway of the M1 motorway as the cars passed. In a private ceremony, Diana was buried on an island in the middle of a lake called the Oval, which is part of the pleasure garden at Althorpe. In her coffin, she wears a black Catherine Walker dress and black tights, and is holding a rosary in her hands. The rosary had been a gift from Mother Teresa of Calcutta, a confidant of Diana, who had died the day before her funeral. A visitors' center is open during summer months, with an exhibition about Diana and a walk around the lake. All profits were donated to the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund. Reactions. Royal family. Queen Elizabeth II expressed her dismay at Diana's death. Then Prince Charles woke his sons before dawn to share the news. Upon announcement of the death, the website of the royal family temporarily removed all its content and replaced it with a black background, displaying a picture of Diana accompanied by her name and dates of birth and death. An online book of condolence was also made available on the website for the public to post their personal tributes. On Sunday morning after Diana's death, the Queen, Princes Charles, William, and Harry all wore black to church services at Crathy Kirk near Balmoral Castle. The royal family later issued a statement, saying Charles, William, and Harry were taking strength from and deeply touched by and enormously grateful for the public support. Princes Andrew and Edward met the mourners outside Kensington Palace as a precautionary measure to test the public mood, and Edward visited St. James's Palace to sign the Book of Condolences. On their way from Crathy Kirk to Balmoral, the Queen, Prince Philip, Charles, William, and Harry viewed the floral tributes and messages left by the public. Charles and his sons returned to London on Friday, September 5. They made an unannounced visit to see the floral tributes left outside Kensington Palace. The Queen, who returned to London from Balmoral accompanied by Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret, agreed to a television broadcast to the nation. She viewed the floral tributes in front of Buckingham Palace and visited the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, where Diana's body was remaining, and met crowds that were in line to sign the books of condolence. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, and her former sister-in-law, Sarah, Duchess of York also visited St. James's Palace. The royal family was criticized for a rigid adherence to protocol, and their efforts to protect the privacy of Diana's grieving sons were interpreted as a lack of compassion. In particular, the refusal of Buckingham Palace to fly the royal standard at half-mast provoked angry headlines in newspapers. The palace's stance was one of royal protocol: no flag could fly over Buckingham Palace, as the royal standard is only flown when the monarch is in residence, and the Queen was then in Scotland. The royal standard never flies at half-mast as it is the sovereign's flag, and there is never an interregnum or vacancy in the monarchy, as the new monarch immediately succeeds his or her predecessor. Finally, as a compromise, the Union flag was flown at half-mast as the Queen left for Westminster Abbey on the day of the funeral. This set a precedent, and Buckingham Palace has subsequently flown the Union flag when the monarch is not in residence. A rift between Prince Charles and the Queen's private secretary, Sir Robert Fellows, was reported in the media over the nature of the funeral, with Charles demanding a public funeral and Fellows supporting the Queen's idea of a private one. The palace later issued a statement denying such rumours. Discussions were also held with the Spencer family and the British royal family as to whether Diana's HRH style needed to be restored posthumously, but Diana's family decided that it would be against Diana's wishes and no formal offer was made. The funeral committee at Buckingham Palace wanted William and Harry to have a bigger role in their mother's funeral, and Downing Street officials suggested that they could walk in the funeral cortege, but faced opposition from Prince Philip, who reportedly stated they've just lost their mother. "You're talking about them as if they are commodities." Prince Harry said in 2017 that the death of his mother caused severe depression and grief. William was 15 and Harry was 12 when Diana died. Politicians. British Prime Minister Tony Blair said that he was utterly devastated by the death of the princess. US President Bill Clinton said that he and his wife, Hillary Clinton, were profoundly saddened when they found out about her death. Kofi Annan, the United Nations Secretary-General, said that her death has robbed the world of a consistent and committed voice for the improvement of the lives of suffering children worldwide. In Australia, the Deputy Prime Minister, Tim Fischer, condemned the paparazzi for their overzealous coverage of Diana. Russian President Boris Yeltsin praised Diana's charity work in a statement, saying, "All know of Princess Diana's big contribution to charitable work, and not only in Great Britain." Among other politicians who sent messages of condolences were Australian Prime Minister John Howard, South African President Nelson Mandela, Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, New Zealand Prime Minister Jim Bolger, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The Australian House of Representatives and the New Zealand House of Representatives also passed parliamentary motions of condolence. The Government of Canada, as well as individual provinces in the country, set up online and in-person books of condolences in their parliament buildings, and memorial services were held across the country. Following her death, delegates at an international conference in Oslo to ban landmines paid their tributes to Diana, who was an avid campaigner for banning the explosive devices. The Ottawa Treaty, which created an international ban on the use of anti-personnel landmines, was adopted in Oslo in September 1997 and signed by 122 states in Ottawa on December 3, 1997. Diana's work on the landmines issue has been described as influential in the signing of the treaty. Public. In London, thousands of people carried bouquets and stood outside Buckingham Palace after the news of her death. People started bringing flowers within an hour after the news was shared. The BBC flew its flags at half-mast. Both radio and television aired the British national anthem, God Save the Queen, in response to Diana's death, as is precedent for the death of a member of the royal family. An elegy was published by Ted Hughes to mark her death. Sporting events in the UK were rearranged, with demands for Scotland's Football Association chief executive to resign due to their delayed response to reschedule Scotland's World Cup qualifier. People in the US were shocked at her death. In San Francisco, around 14,000 people marched through the city in a procession on September 5 to pay tribute to Diana, honoring her for her work on behalf of AIDS patients. In Los Angeles, more than 2,500 people transformed a baseball field into a candle-lit altar in a memorial service prepared by an AIDS organization. In Paris, thousands of people visited the site of the crash and the hospital where Diana died, leaving bouquets, candles and messages. People brought flowers and also attempted to visit the Hotel Ritz. On the eve of the funeral, 300 members of the British community in Paris took part in a service of commemoration. Landmine victims in Angola and Bosnia also honored Diana with separate services, pointing out how her efforts had helped raise awareness about the damage caused by landmines. In Bosnia, a landmine survivor, Jasminko Bjlic, who had met Diana only 3 weeks earlier, said, "She was our friend." In Egypt, the homeland of Dodi Fayed, people visited the British Embassy in Cairo to pay their tributes and sign a book of condolences. Following her death, many celebrities including actors and singers blamed the paparazzi and condemned their reckless behavior. Mother Teresa, who met Diana a few months before her death, expressed her sorrow, and prayers were held at the Missionaries of Charity for Diana. The Bishop of Bradford David Smith and the Bradford Council of Mosques held prayers by the Christian and Muslim communities. Jonathan Sacks led prayers by the Jewish community at the Western Marble Arch Synagogue, and Cardinal Basil Hume presided over the Roman Catholic Requiem Mass held at Westminster Cathedral. Mother Teresa died on September 5, 1997, the day before Diana's funeral. Social and economic impact. Reception. Memorials. In the years after her death, many memorials were commissioned and dedicated to her. As a temporary memorial, the public co-opted the Flamme de la Liberté, a monument near the Pont de l'Alma tunnel related to the French donation of the Statue of Liberty to the U.S. The messages of condolence have since been removed and its use as a Diana memorial has discontinued, though visitors still leave messages in her memory. A permanent memorial, the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fountain, was opened by the Queen in Hyde Park in London on July 6, 2004, followed by a statue in the sunken garden of Kensington Palace, which was unveiled by her sons on July 1, 2021. Following her death, a member of the Millennium Domes board suggested the project be refashioned and extended to accommodate, for example, a hospital, businesses, charities, private residences, and the whole thing named the Princess Diana Center. The idea was later scrapped. Inquests. Under English law, an inquest is required in cases of sudden or unexplained death. A French judicial investigation had already been carried out, but the 6,000-page report was never published. On January 6, 2004, 6 years after Diana's death, an inquest into the crash opened in London, held by Michael Burgess, the coroner of the Queen's household. The coroner asked the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir John Stevens, to make inquiries in response to speculation that the deaths were not an accident. Forensic scientist Angela Gallup was commissioned to examine the forensic evidence. The police investigation reported its findings in Operation Paget in December 2006. In January 2006, Lord Stevens explained in an interview on GMTV that the case is substantially more complex than once thought. The Sunday Times wrote on January 29, 2006 that agents of the British Secret Service were cross-examined because they were in Paris at the time of the crash. It was suggested in many journals that these agents might have exchanged the blood test from Henri Paul with another blood sample. The inquests into the deaths of Diana and Fate opened on January 8, 2007, with Dame Elizabeth Butler-Sloss acting as Deputy Coroner of the Queen's household for the Diana inquest and Assistant Deputy Coroner for Surrey in relation to the Fate inquest. Butler-Sloss originally intended to sit without a jury. This decision was later overturned by the High Court of Justice, as well as the jurisdiction of the Coroner of the Queen's household. On April 24, 2007, Butler-Sloss stepped down, saying she lacked the experience required to deal with an inquest with a jury. The role of coroner for the inquests was transferred to Lord Justice Scott Baker, who formally took up the role on June 13 as coroner for Inner West London. On July 27, 2007, Baker, following representations for the lawyers of the interested parties, issued a list of issues likely to be raised at the inquest, many of which had been dealt with in great detail by Operation Paget. Whether driver error on the part of Henri Paul caused or contributed to the cause of the collision. Whether Henri Paul's ability to drive was impaired through drink or drugs. Whether a Fiat Uno or any other vehicle caused or contributed to the collision. Whether the actions of the paparazzi caused or contributed to the cause of the collision. Whether the road/tunnel layout and construction were inherently dangerous and, if so, whether this contributed to the collision. Whether any bright/flashing lights contributed to or caused the collision and, if so, their source. Whose decision it was that Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed should leave from the rear entrance to the Ritz and that Henri Paul should drive the vehicle. Henri Paul's movements between 7 and 10 p.m. on August 30, 1997. The explanation for the money in Henri Paul's possession on August 30, 1997 and in his bank account. Whether Andon, a photographer who followed the princess in the week before her death, was in Paris on the night of the collision. Whether Diana's life would have been saved if she had reached hospital sooner or if her medical treatment had been different. Whether Diana was pregnant. Whether Diana and Dodi Al-Fayed were about to announce their engagement. Whether and, if so in what circumstances, the Princess of Wales feared for her life. The circumstances relating to the purchase of the ring. The circumstances in which Diana's body was embalmed. Whether the evidence of Tomlinson throws any light on the collision. Whether the British or any other security services had any involvement in the collision. Whether there was anything sinister about the Cherualt burglary or the disturbance at the Big Pictures Agency. Whether correspondence belonging to Diana has disappeared, and if so the circumstances. The inquests officially began on October 2, 2007 with the swearing of a jury of 6 women and 5 men. Lord Justice Baker delivered a lengthy opening statement giving general instructions to the jury and introducing the evidence. The BBC reported that Mohammed Al-Fayed, having earlier reiterated his claim that his son and Diana were murdered by the royal family, immediately criticized the opening statement as biased. The inquest heard evidence from people connected with Diana and the events leading to her death, including Rhys Jones, Mohammed Al-Fayed, Paul Burrell, Diana's stepmother, and the former head of MI6. Lord Justice Baker began his summing up to the jury on March 31, 2008. He opened by telling the jury, "No one except you and I think, the gentleman in the public gallery with Diana and Fayed painted on his forehead sat through every word of evidence and concluded that there was not a shred of evidence that Diana's death had been ordered by Prince Philip or organized by the security services." He concluded his summing up on Wednesday, April 2, 2008. After summing up, the jury retired to consider 5 verdicts, namely unlawful killing by the negligence of either or both the following vehicles or Paul, accidental death or an open verdict. The jury decided on April 7, 2008 that Diana had been unlawfully killed by the grossly negligent driving of the following vehicles and of the Mercedes driver Henri Paul. Princes William and Harry released a statement in which they said that they agree with their verdicts and are both hugely grateful. Mohammed Al-Fayed also said that he would accept the verdict and abandon his 10-year campaign to prove that Diana and Dodi were murdered in a conspiracy. The cost of the inquiry exceeded £12.5 million. The coroner's inquest cost £4.5 million. A further £8 million was spent on the Metropolitan Police investigation. It lasted 6 months and heard 250 witnesses, with the cost heavily criticized in the media. Related lawsuits. 9 photographers, who had been following Diana and Dodi in 1997, were charged with manslaughter in France. France's highest court dropped the charges in 2002. 3 photographers who took pictures of the aftermath of the crash on August 31, 1997 had their photographs confiscated and were tried for invasion of privacy for taking pictures through the open door of the crashed car. The photographers, who were part of the paparazzi, were acquitted in 2003. Conspiracy theories. Although the initial French investigation found that Diana had died as a result of an accident, several conspiracy theories have been raised. Since February 1998, Fayed's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, has claimed that the crash was a result of a conspiracy, and later contended that the crash was orchestrated by MI6 on the instructions of the royal family. His claims were dismissed by a French judicial investigation and by Operation Paget. On April 7, 2008, Lord Justice Baker's inquest into the deaths of Diana and Fayed ended with the jury concluding that they were the victims of an unlawful killing by Henri Paul and the drivers of the following vehicles. Additional factors were the impairment of the judgment of the driver of the Mercedes through alcohol, and the death of the deceased was caused or contributed to by the fact that the deceased was not wearing a seat belt, the fact that the Mercedes struck the pillar in the Alma Tunnel rather than colliding with something else. On August 17, 2013, Scotland Yard revealed that they were examining the credibility of information from a source that alleged that Diana was murdered by a member of the British military. In the media, actor George Clooney was critical of several tabloids and paparazzi agencies following Diana's death. A few of the tabloids boycotted Clooney following the outburst, stating that he owed a fair portion of his celebrity to the tabloids and photo agencies in question. In September 1997, a number of supermarket chains in the U.S. removed the September 9 issue of the National Enquirer, which bore the title "De Goes Sex Mad." The paper's editor described the incident as an unfortunate circumstance, which was not meant to coincide with her death. Another American tabloid, Globe, issued an apology for its headline to DIF4. Diana was ranked third in the 2002 Great Britain's poll sponsored by the BBC and voted for by the British public, after Sir Winston Churchill, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel, just above Charles Darwin, William Shakespeare, and Isaac Newton. That same year, another British poll named Diana's death as the most important event in the country's last 100 years. Historian Nick Barrett criticized this outcome as being a pretty shocking result. Later in 2004, the CBS program 48 Hours broadcast photos from the crash scene which were part of a 4,000-page French government report. They showed an intact rear side and center section of the Mercedes, including one of an unbloodied Diana with no outward injuries crouched on the rear floor with her back to the right passenger seat. The right rear door is fully open. The release of these pictures was poorly received in the UK, where it was felt that the privacy of Diana was being infringed. Buckingham Palace, Prime Minister Tony Blair and Diana's brother condemned the action, while CBS defended its decision, saying that the pictures are placed in journalistic context and examination of the medical treatment given to Princess Diana just after the crash. On July 13, 2006, Italian magazine Chi published photographs that showed Diana amid the wreckage of the car crash. The photos were released despite an unofficial blackout on such photographs being published. The editor of Chi defended his decision by saying he published the photographs simply because they had not been previously seen, and he felt the images were not disrespectful to the memory of Diana. The British newspaper, the Daily Express, was criticised for continued and sustained coverage of Diana following her death. A 2006 report in The Guardian showed that the newspaper had mentioned her in numerous recent news stories, with headlines including, "Perhaps Diana should have worn seatbelt," "Diana Inquiry Chief's laptop secrets stolen," £250,000 a year bill to run Diana Fountain, and "Diana seatbelt sabotage probe." The events from Diana's death to her funeral became the subject of a 2006 film, The Queen, with Helen Mirren in the title role. Internet coverage. Diana's death occurred at a time when internet use in the developed world was booming, and several national newspapers and at least one British regional newspaper had already launched online news services. BBC News had set up online coverage of the general election earlier in 1997, and as a result of the widespread public and media attention surrounding Diana's death, BBC News swiftly created a website featuring news coverage of Diana's death and the events that followed it. Diana's death helped BBC News officials realize how important online news services were becoming, and a full online news service was launched on November 4 that year, alongside the launch of the BBC's rolling news channel BBC News 24 on November 9. See also: Concert for Diana, a 2007 rock concert to commemorate Diana. Diana, Last Days of a Princess, a 2007 television docudrama. List of people who died in traffic collisions. The Little White Car, a 2004 novel based around the mystery Fiat Uno. The Murder of Princess Diana, a 2007 book disputing the official version of events. The Murder of Princess Diana, a 2007 Lifetime Movies film, a fictionalized adaptation of the book of the same name. Princess Diana's Revenge, a 2006 novel that engages with conspiracy theories relating to Diana's death. The Queen, a 2006 film about the royal family's reaction to Diana's death. Unlawful Killing, a 2011 documentary film. References